So fairly recently, Green Day played Coachella, right? There was a lot of controversy around it for a ton of reasons, but one of the things that I was reminded of is Green Day is like deeply political, right? And I always think it's interesting how Green Day, they're one of those bands that gets really misconstrued, right? Like, as somebody who's been listening to them since they were a kid, I'm obviously familiar with like what a lot of the people in the band say about these issues. And a lot of people from the opposite side of the spectrum will latch onto the band and go, no, I love them, and they agree with me. Which is interesting, right? Because all political discussion aside, I think it just brings up a really interesting idea of like, what does art mean? Like, all art is up for interpretation. I think Green Day's an example I want to distance myself from really quickly here, because some of their art is definitely not quite as up for interpretation. You know, like some of the lyrics on their American Idiot album are pretty to the point, right? However, with that being said, art is up for interpretation, and I think it's always interesting when a piece of art gets, I don't know if co-opted is the word, but embraced by a group of people who the author would disagree with. Because on the one hand, there's like that temptation to have the Twitter response of going, these people are dumb, they don't understand this, I'm smart, I get it, I agree with the author, and I agreed with them even before I knew what the author thought, right? Like, there's something very validating about that. But I think there's also a huge argument to be made in the form of death of the author, right? Or is it death of the artist? We'll go with death of the author, right? I'm pretty sure that's what it is. Death of the author is basically this concept of once an artist puts out their work into the world, they effectively die. They don't have any say anymore. They cannot dictate what their work means once it's out in the world. And I think it's a very interesting concept. I don't know, I think it's sort of like one of those things where you gotta separate it from a philosophical basis, like a very functional basis. Because on a functional basis, like, death of the artist is so true. Death of the author, death of the author. Death of the author is so true. Like, that's just how this works. 1,000,000%. I mean, how many times have people just like completely taken a work and flipped it on its head to fit what they want it to be and not cared? And that's fine. Like, that's kind of why art's so cool, right? Because you can do that. You can't do that with science. People try, believe me, but you can't really do that with science the way that you can totally do it and have it work with art. Art is very much up to the interpretation of the audience on a functional basis. And I mean, this happens with like people, groups can fully take art and just change the narrative on what it actually means. Like, there are plenty of times throughout history where like a piece has been embraced by a certain group, and like for a long time, that's just what that piece was. Like Nietzsche, after the 1930s, like Nietzsche was not a philosopher that he is now, where like people would be on TikTok talking about Nietzsche. If you were in the 1950s being like, yeah, I love this Nietzsche guy, I'd be like, get away from me, I gotta call somebody. You know, like, he was an artist, he was a philosopher, but sort of an artist, right, in his writings, who was fully embraced by Hitler, and because of that, like, you could not read Nietzsche without separating from that. For a while, that's just what that meant. Of course, later on, people took the work and it kind of stood on its own 2 feet, but functionally, yeah, like the artist did die in that scenario, in term, not just literally, that horse really did him in, but also like on a basis of like his work was completely, fully pulled away from what he would have wanted it to be. Perhaps, I mean, you know, there's some debate there too with Nietzsche, but I think Orwell's a big example of this, where like a bunch of people who Orwell would disagree with are now on Twitter wearing hats that say like, make Orwell fiction again. Like, Elon Musk retweeted that. Do you know what Orwell would have said about Elon Musk? Like, that's, you know, that's just not taking all of my opinions aside. Looking at the body of work that Orwell wrote in his lifetime, it's not even, he would not love that retweet. He would not, you know, I think he would have had a twit longer after that. So I think there's a case in which like that's very true, you know? But there's also like a really great argument that like, no, the author's interpretation does matter more. I think death of the author is not only, but I should have emphasized this, I think death of the author is not only an argument that the author's interpretation doesn't matter, but I think kind of the other side of it has to be that the audience is then equal to the author. Not so much the audience would be superior, but just that the author's interpretation matters just as much and therefore as little as the author itself. Like, it's almost like they don't have any say over me. I think though, like, to Death of the Author, there's a really great rebuttal of like, they do know the work better than anyone else. For an example, I think a great way to look at it is like when artists on an album will often have different drafts of songs. Like I think on Graduation by Kanye, he had like over 300 versions of Stronger. There's probably an interpretation in there that like greatly changes what that song means, you know? Maybe it's a different lyric or a different tone or a different melody. Like there are so many places where you could look at that and go, there could be other versions of this that only he is privy to by proxy of him being the guy making this. And I think that's a really great argument toward the camp of like, no, the author does matter way more than the people viewing it. I think there's a lot of credence to that. I mean, it's pretty hard to argue against either of these, right? Because on the one hand, death of the author is certainly happening. Like, you can just look around to the world and go like, okay, people really don't care at all about what these guys actually thought. They just take their work and imprint whatever they mean onto it. So like, I think it's hard not to look at that and go like, okay, so that's true. But I think there's also a way you have to sort of acknowledge, like, even though they're taking the work and giving it a different meaning, that doesn't mean that they understand 1984 on a more correct level than Orwell himself. Like, I think that's a crazy thing to say. Because it's just, I think it's objectively untrue, right? How can you understand something better than the guy that made it? I think maybe the whole there too, though, is like, what about the people who study something their whole life? Like, there are scholars devoted to certain philosophers who literally have just read that one philosopher their whole life. And I mean, you know, that person who understands every single angle you could possibly take, let's say I don't know if they're actual Orwell scholars, but let's say, you know, going with this 1984 example, let's say there is an Orwell scholar, they might have a better voice than Orwell. I keep going to say Warhol. I probably said Warhol a couple times here. They probably have a better voice than Orwell, not so much in the sense that maybe they understand the work on like you know, they didn't make it, so they can never understand it the same way Warhol does, or Orwell does, oh my god. But being, what are we, almost 100 years removed from that book being made, being written, and having a plethora of different perspectives and seeing the way that this work can be embraced by all these different crowds, they probably have a more, maybe not an actual better perspective, I think that's tough to say, but at least a more rounded perspective on like, where could you take this? Like, I think that's a pretty good counter to that. Like, as much as could they sit down with Orwell and be like, I understand your book better than you, maybe not, but they could probably point out a lot more angles of the way the work could take than Orwell. I know for me personally, whenever I've had friends of mine read like writings or I've had like a couple friends read a book I wrote, right? And they got completely different things than what I was ever intending. And like, in a sense, you know, it's not that they, speaking from the artist's perspective for a second, it's not that I think they understand the work better than me, but it's almost this idea that like, I can't see these things when I'm in the middle of it, you know? What's that phrase? It's like, a fish didn't discover water. You know, it's tough to see some of these things when you're right in the middle of it. So there are, I think, isn't that why Stephen King, like, he writes a book in full and then comes back to it, like, months later, I think at least like a month later or something, and will only read it then with a new fresh set of eyes to look for symbols and metaphors and all these things. And I think that makes a good point of like, you gotta sort of get away and outside of something to understand it or to maybe see it with those fresh eyes, you know? Like, have you guys ever written a paper and had somebody proofread it and you didn't notice 1/5 of the typos in there? I think it could be the same thing with just creating art in general, of like, you know, you don't notice everything you're putting into it because making art is not a process that's super systematic or rigid, right? So I think like in that sense, I empathize with the people that are like, I don't think the artist has any actual say on this at all. And so like I have to be like, I get that perspective, but I can't remove myself from the idea that like, I think a lot of this could be the fact that I am somebody that does create, like I write and I do art. I try to avoid calling myself an artist because I don't think I'm quite deserving of that label yet, you know, unless you go to my YouTube bio, then I am, or my dot card portfolio, then I also am. But in terms of referring to myself, I don't think I quite deserve that title, but as somebody that makes stuff, I'll say, it's hard for me to be like, no, people could hypothetically understand my works better than me. Like that notion seems weird to me. For somebody to say like, hey, like if you guys watch this and DM me like, hey, just watch that new Paint&Talk, you don't know it, but I know what you were painting better than you do. Like I'd be like, okay, so I have a crazy person texting me right now. Like I'd be like, that's weird, right? But I couldn't deny the fact that, like I remember on one Paint&Talk, this was a while back, way before Paint&Talk 100, you know, before we hit the triple digit mark, somebody commented on a Paint&Talk like, this looks like a bigger man with his belly and legs protruding from the shadows, and I was painting an arm. And like, I couldn't deny that I did not see that at all until they commented that. Sometimes you just can't see the shapes when you're the one making them. As for my actual answer to this though, if I'm to, you know, remove my hat of trying to think of this from different angles and just give my answer, I think I just do whatever I want, to be honest. I think like for me to, like sometimes you gotta go with death of the author just through ignorance alone, right? Like I don't have, when I'm just like on YouTube or whatever, that's a terrible example. When I'm on Letterboxd looking for a movie to watch and I watch a movie, I don't have time to look into the director's background before I dive into this movie. Like that's just, I don't have enough time in a day to do that. I barely have time to watch the movie, right? So like, in a way I have to treat that as true. But I do think it's cool when I can find out like, oh, this author made this with the exact same thing in mind that I think of when I watch it. That's just cool to me, but I'd be lying if I didn't say it wasn't like pretty trivial. You know, I think it's more so just like isn't that neat, more than any sort of genuine like, I have a connection to this work or I understand this on a deeper level. So often too, this does come down to just like political backgrounds, you know, like if you share the exact same political stance as the artist making it, you will oftentimes have a much closer view, at least in my experience. But like just not even political, like just a worldview. If you share a worldview with an artist, you'll oftentimes interpret things much closer. So I don't know. I think I treat it as fairly trivial when I do share the same interpretation as an artist, but I also do think it's very cool. So I don't really know. I kind of just go with whatever happens. I don't see it as being all that serious of a thing. But I think it's an interesting conversation nonetheless, of like, can you really remove a work from its author? And I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on it. This is sort of a skyline idea for a lot of the buildings and architecture I've been doing. I figured, you know, why not bring it together? And it didn't come out good, like I wanted it to. But, you know, I think it'll look cool with the other ones. I'm planning on doing an Instagram post where they're all together, so I think it'll look cool in that post. But, you know, I think you know, me making art to adorn Instagram posts makes me deeply unserious, so I don't want to exactly admit that. Go check it out on the Instagram, though. It's going to be great. Yeah, go check it out on the Instagram. And until next time, guys, gals, and pals, my name is Max Dice. This has been Paint Talk, episode 113. I'm here every morning, painting and talking with you all.